Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us in our In Conversation with the outgoing Under Treasurer and new CEO of the Queensland Treasury Corporation, Leon Allen. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're here in Brisbane on the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge all First Nations people joining us online today, as well as the traditional owners of all of the lands that you might be joining us on from today. I do want to acknowledge that this week is a week of action for the Yes campaign, and absolutely QCOSS puts their support behind the Yes campaign. We are grateful for the generous offer from First Nations people to walk towards constitutional recognition together, and we look forward to supporting a yes vote in the referendum. Can I also just thank QUT Centre for Justice for supporting us to bring this event to you today. QUT Centre for Justice is a great friend of QCOSS and such a wonderful partner, and we're really grateful for their support. So today's event is an In Conversation with Leon Allen. As I said, he is the outgoing Under Treasurer and has been with Treasury since May 2020 and in the role of Under Treasurer since September 2021. Leon has this week started in the role as CEO of Queensland Treasury Corporation, so we're absolutely thrilled that he was still able to meet with us. Obviously, Leon has such an amazing background. Prior to joining Treasury, he was at the Commonwealth Bank for about 15 years, holding leadership roles with both the domestic and international focus. Leon also is on the board of he chairs the State Investment Advisory Board, and he chairs the South Bank Corporation Board, and he's just recently left the Trade and Investment Queensland Board. I've got to say, Leon has been a really wonderful friend to QCOSS and the community services sector, and we've really enjoyed a great working relationship with Treasury under Leon's leadership. We're really grateful to have you here today, Leon. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a very kind introduction. Thank you very much. And I'll also, on behalf of Treasury and all my colleagues in Treasury and government, also acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians on the land of which we meet and everyone's meeting today. And I think join with you in acknowledging the process that's commenced this week around the voice. And having recently read the document, I thought I'd better read it and make sure I understand fully what's going on there. But I love the sentiment it has around acknowledging that some of our people walk in two cultures, and we as an organisation, as a country, will be richer for that, and having that recognised. And there's a degree of empowerment that goes with it that hopefully will come from this process. So, like you, I think we're very invested in seeing a great outcome there. And that's, I should probably reflect a little bit of personal sentiment as much as anything, but I think it's been a really productive few years for QCOSS and government and for Treasury. And I'll also, while I'm in the business of acknowledging, recognise the great leadership that Rachel Hunter provided to the momentum in this relationship. And for those that don't know, Rachel is currently the Director General of the Department of Premier Cabinet, but hired me as a deputy when she was Under Treasurer, when the Treasurer, Cameron Dick, took over the portfolio. She moved with the Treasurer from State Development. And, you know, she's got a great feel for public policy, and I thought, you know, provided great leadership. And my first cameo on this was similar to what we're going to hear from Marianne Kelly today, where Marianne Kelly's the acting Under Treasurer, and I think as an acting Under Treasurer, I provided a bit of a video snapshot into this discussion that you had with Rachel. So I want to say, and so Marianne's going to do that today. And yes, I am the outgoing Under Treasurer. I was more than happy to keep involved because it has been such a productive relationship, and I think a great credit to the voice that QCOSS provides to social services in this state, and I think the way you've gone about it goes to the heart of some of the things we're going to discuss today about being engaged on a regular basis and having good conversations, rich conversations based on a lot of information and evidence to inform policy making. And if I could maybe, if you can indulge me, and since we last caught up and what's happened since the last budget, one of the key themes we had from last year is it's really important to consider the budget process as an ongoing cycle. It's not a point in time event. And I should get in a couple of months before the budget if I want to get anything happening. Where I think, QCOSS knows, and I think we've discussed the benefit of having an ongoing discussion and dialogue. And a couple of things sort of really are called out for me. The work we did on NGO indexation. I think I recall a conversation at the budget breakfast last year.
Yep.
The CEO taking full advantage of having the minister right there beside her and a whole audience there listening. But we, I thought, did some great work there, and we saw in the budget mid-year review. So we have an annual budget. We update it halfway through the year to reflect any changes in the economy and the fiscal impacts of that and any program decisions that have been made. And, we saw in the update published in December a change to that methodology, which I think is a great outcome, reflecting better understanding of the cost pressures that can be faced, particularly in areas in environments of economic dislocation. And so I thought that was a really good outcome. And we saw also, I think, with the housing side and the housing investment fund that's got a particular Treasury focus, a lot of work in housing over the years. And I think I'm really pleased with the way Treasury engaged on that. And we saw an increase in the housing investment fund in our part of the portfolio, which I think if I could make a call out for the process there's an EOI process out at the moment that we're looking for by May. So I'm sure you've got part of your membership who'll be leaning into that process. I just think it's a couple of examples of where it's as much as what you do outside of the formal budget day that's really important, not just what happens in the proximity to the publication of the budget and the delivery of the budget and passing of appropriation bills.
Yeah, thank you.
There we go. A bit long-winded, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Leon, and it is really encouraging, I'm sure, for all of us to hear about, everything that QCOSS does is deeply informed by what we hear from our members, and any outcomes that we get are obviously due to the engagement and support of our members. So I'm sure it pleases everyone to hear about the work that you've all done and the impact it's had. So thank you to all of our members who are joining us, who have been part of that. I do just have a few housekeeping notes that I've got to share. So we're broadcasting in Zoom mode. You can ask questions if you like to throughout the session. I do already have some that we've received prior to the event, and I'll be referring to those throughout my conversation with Leon today. Also, the session is being recorded, so if that's not for you, it might be time to jump off. So, Leon, you really did lead Treasury through some years of fairly significant disruption. What are your reflections on that?
Yes, 3 years, I think, in the life of Treasury that's as old as the state itself. Doesn't seem like much, but coming out of COVID, obviously a very tumultuous time. And at a personal level, I saw that as a great opportunity, because when there's periods of change, that's where there's periods of opportunity for reform. And it was genuinely, for me, part of the motivation in going into the job. I was no doubt coming from the perspective that I had worked in Treasury many years ago when I was a very junior person, and then to combine that with having the perspectives of being outside of government, the opportunity to come in was pretty exciting. And I could see the leadership with someone like Rachel there, and the broader leadership team in Treasury, some great people that have been in Treasury a long period of time, that are very experienced, and I just saw that as a great opportunity. And I hope that we took as much advantage of those opportunities over this last 3 years to do two things. Hopefully we've improved outcomes in our areas of policy responsibility, and hopefully Treasury itself is also a better place and a great place to work, which is what we sort of tried to focus on for the individuals inside of Treasury and across government. And it's a central agency and it has a big responsibility. I like the way it goes about business, and it's been great to be part of that team. And in the area that we've been focused on, I think, as I highlighted before, there's been really good things happening, and I think just the nature and the richness of the dialogue I see has got a lot better. And I think that's a great credit to you and QCOSS, but also I think to the way the Treasury team has sort of lent into the challenge, because you know, there were some really significant impacts and dislocations that have occurred through COVID and out of COVID. Housing's a great case in point, and we can touch on that a bit later. And I think it's been exceptional to watch the level of policy acumen, the development of good evidence and the richness of the dialogue, as I say, that I've seen. So that's, as a general level, been a really good outcome and a good, pleasing thing to have occurred, and that's manifested itself in the economic recovery we've seen in Queensland, and I think in the policy initiatives we've seen over the last couple of years. So you can say Queensland got the health response right, and the investment that went into health after COVID is really big and significant. The investment that's gone into energy transformation, I think, is genuinely of global scale in terms of the ambition, but also the commitment that's been made to invest in energy transition. I think that's a real standout. And at a personal level, you know, have Treasury involved in those two particular policy areas. Our response in the community services sector, I think, has been, you know, I'm sure you'd be saying, well, we could have done a little bit more, Leon, but we've made some genuine progress there.
Absolutely.
And in child safety as well, not just addressing the fact that there's been a real call on resources there, but the discussions we're having now with the department about, you know, driving some reform and change in that space, I think is quite exciting. So that's, you know, for me, real reflections. The establishment of you know, debt reduction fund sounds a bit dry for the audience, so, you know, excuse me a little bit of indulgence there, but also I think our Path to Treaty Fund.
Yes.
The Carbon Reduction Investment Fund, and a Housing Investment Fund. I mean, those are big numbers, but they're producing long-term injections of capital into the system, and that's really important. It gives people certainty, and we can do better planning. And you know, I think they're areas where I think coming out of COVID, the investment piece, we've actually invested into the future. That's been the most satisfying thing for me personally.
So that concept of establishing a fund for a particular purpose and then applying the interest earned from that fund, and I think do we borrow the money for those funds?
Well, this is the unique circumstance where you have capital that's been realised either through revenue that's been earned above forecast, where we've sort of said, well, let's use that, let's devote that to particular purposes. So it's, rather than just purely spending monies that were unexpected, you're actually creating investments that are saying, well, in the long term, let's put that to a different use. And you can see that that could be for long periods or short periods. So if the government has a spike, as we saw in the budget mid-year review, in royalties earnings, they've said, well, actually, we're going to use that to accelerate some investments we're going to make into the regions, in infrastructure, in community building. So they're going to be expensed over a shorter period of time, whereas other ones we're taking a longer term view. So they're just a way, I think, to, as I say, provide certainty and take advantage of, for want of a better term, some windfall gains.
And is that a model that we've copied from other jurisdictions, or? Because I know it exists at a Commonwealth level as well, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, I don't think there's anything sort of unique or proprietary about it. And even for a federal level, they might have had funds in place for a longer period of time. But the concept, I think, is universal.
Yeah.
As I say, it probably relates to particular events where there has been some gains in capital that can be deployed that way. Because governments as a whole, they try hard not to tax too much and to match that with their spending. And then if there's capital to be deployed, that they should think about, well, how much can we really spend in a sensible and sustainable fashion.
Yeah.
So these funds become just an opportunity to make some longer term investments.
Yeah, and provide certainty that that particular priority will be funded into the future.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this week you started at Queensland Treasury Corporation.
Yes.
What is that about? What is the role of the Treasury Corporation?
We are the central financing arm of government. So we basically go and raise debt for the government with both domestic and global investors. So every year government earns revenue, but every year government also makes decisions about, well, we'd like to invest in the future, be it in infrastructure primarily. So that's a borrowing requirement, and so we undertake that borrowing requirement for the state and manage the overall borrowing program.
Okay.
Sounds a bit dry, I appreciate. It's not as not as challenging, as complex as some of the things that you and your members deal with on a daily basis.
It sounds pretty complex to me, Leon. No. So it's February now, and I know that Treasury is in the midst of a budget cycle. And as you said, we've been doing this event for a few years now, talking about what a budget cycle looks like, what the key timings and milestones are, what the process looks like. And as you say, Marianne Kelly is currently acting under Treasurer. So I'm going to throw a question to her, which is really those things. So when does the budget process actually start? What's involved? And what are some of the key milestones that we should be looking out for?
Hi, my name is Marianne Kelly. I'm the acting under Treasurer at Queensland Treasury. I've been in the gig, by the time you would have seen this on Friday, about a week, so it's new shoes that I've got on. It's great to be able to join you today and to be able to talk to you about the budget process, something that is a really core part of what we deliver every year and certainly takes up a lot of our time and energy. Community services sector is an incredibly important part of the services landscape in Queensland. And the Queensland Government has partnered with Community Services and QCOSS for many, many decades before this and for many to come. QCOSS members have a really important role to play to support those Queenslanders in our community, particularly those who are disadvantaged. The annual budget process involves all agencies across the Queensland Government, and as well as working with key stakeholders in the community services sector, in industry and beyond. Each year, individual agencies provide us with an update on their fiscal position, their financial position, an update on how they're going in delivering initiatives that we put in last year's budget and budgets before that. And they also raise with us particular areas where they may not have funding, or there's been new pressures that have been put on the system, and they will be seeking additional funding as part of the budget process. This is an opportunity for the department to state why. What's the cause, what's the issue, the problem that we're trying to address. It's really important when we're looking at these budget proposals that they articulate the stakeholders that they've engaged with. So that will be stakeholders like QCOSS and its members. As part of that, I think it's important to say it's important that QCOSS and its members engage with government at the budget process time, but just as important that it happens throughout the year as we progress, as things are moving through the system. We're now heading into late February. Agencies will be pulling together their budget submissions and they'll provide it through to central agencies in the early part of March. We will then be developing material to support ministers, the budget the Cabinet Budget Review Committee, which is a small group of ministers that each year determine what are the highest priorities in terms of budget for that year. As you can imagine, it's usually a lot of deliberations that go on. We have finite resources and we have to determine where are the most important priorities for this particular year in investing taxpayers' money. Budget day is usually in early June every year. This year it is the 13th of June. At that point, you would have seen it many times before, the Treasurer will get up, he will give his speech, he will table the budget papers. Now those budget papers include a couple of really important things. The economic and fiscal outlook for the state. It articulates new initiatives that reflect government policies for the coming year and beyond. But they also articulate key issues and areas for particular stakeholder groups. So for example, the last couple of years and this year we'll be looking at a women's budget statement. That process is a pretty intense one through to the middle of June. And what I'd say is that the Queensland Government's overarching priorities as part of those budget papers and the budget process is good jobs, better services, and ensuring we continue to protect the state's great lifestyle. In line with budget's priorities, and look, I've worked in the social policy space for decades now, the state budget invests a lot of money into the social services sector. It's something like in the 22-23 budget, 65% of the state's budget was directed towards core social services. Two of the big ones being health, which is about 30% of the budget's expenditure, and education, which is about 24% of expenditure. It will continue, social services, social support, focused on better lifestyles, healthier outcomes for folks, safer lifestyles, will continue to be the government's focus this year and beyond. And investing in those social services as part of this budget will be core. Because, you know, growing the economy is fundamental, and delivering on those services in partnership with QCOSS and its partners is incredibly important for this government. Hi, my name.
So Leon, in around June, we all get very excited to see what the government's funding, what the priorities are. It's a good signal to us about what the government really cares about. So can you talk me through how those particular priorities for a budget are determined?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, their budget is a statement of the government's intentions for the year ahead. And as you'd imagine, there's some reflection on what should be the emphasis for a particular budget, and that's something that needs to occur early to sort of shape how departments respond and bring forward proposals that affect their portfolio that relate to those I guess, themes for the budget. And we should also, when we talk about that, talk about where the government has itself signalled its higher order priorities that in effect bridge many budgets. And you can see those change. I mean, early on in my tenure, the government's focus on COVID and then coming out of COVID, you know, the whole unite and recover thematic. And I think I spoke to the emphasis that was given to health and to recovery in the most general sense. And you know, they were clearly discussions that were had at the ministerial level about what should the priorities for the budget be. Those have evolved at a higher level, and I sort of, in that sense, think about the good, better, best. You know, good jobs, you know, better services, and great lifestyle. I always put good, better, best. But it's the great lifestyle. That's the government saying, look, we really are keen to ensure that the decisions we make, the investments we're making through the budget, are supporting those general thematics. But early on in a budget process in any one year, they will try and establish some priorities and signal that to organisations and to ministers about where they see, you know, the relative priorities. And that then plays back into how governments evaluate or assess proposals that are brought forward by the ministries.
Yeah. Well, I think that would make sense to a lot of people listening, that you would set sort of key strategic kind of objectives and then communicate that broadly and then assess proposals based on those priorities.
Yeah.
And then the other part, I guess, that would be the next natural step would be to continually assess whether the outcomes you've achieved through the decisions you've made are getting you closer to the objectives that you set in the beginning. So how does Treasury take a role in assessing the impact of the investments, and if so, how?
Yes. The answer is yes, we do. That can be direct or it can be indirect. So, you know, in a budget cycle, if you think about it in pure management sense, you know, the plan, do, check, act is played out both on a large scale and a micro scale, depending on what level you're looking at, either whole of government, portfolio level, agency level, program level.
Yeah.
And you know, that logic holds up regardless of which area you're focused on. So Treasury's obviously putting together a lot of information at a whole of government level, but it's got to be informed by an understanding of activities at the portfolio level and at the program level, depending on the relative priority and the importance at any one point in time, because you can't, in effect, evaluate every program to its nth degree on an annual basis. That's just physically not possible. You know, you'd be boiling the ocean, as it were. But clearly there's times when government itself makes decisions saying we want to see something reviewed, and they'll either ask public servants directly to do it, or they might commission external parties to do review work. It could be a combination thereof, and we've seen a fairly high profile, or significant number of high profile external review activities done under sort of notional commissions of inquiry, the like, that feed into policy development. But in the normal course, programs will go through a cycle where we set up early a decision to invest, and we're trying to create some objectives that can be measured to allow us to assess how a program is tracking and whether there should be some consideration of continued investment or some reorientation of the program and the spending that supports it to achieve those higher order objectives. And that is a really healthy part of, I guess, program management and budgeting and our overall, you know, performance management system, which sounds a bit dry and managerial, but it's really important to try and have those disciplines around decisions that have been taken to address high priority policy issues and evaluating the performance of those investments and the programs that really reflect the government's decisions, saying we want to see whether the structure and operation of this program is working well and whether we need to redirect effort, add to effort, or thoroughly, you know, reset and change altogether.
And what elements of all of that sort of ongoing evaluation and feedback are actually shared publicly?
Well, I guess I highlighted it'll depend on the type of work that's been undertaken. So if it's a commission of inquiry, it's very public.
Yes. Yeah.
And then there might be work that the government has said, you know, it wants to make this information available to a particular sector or industry to give some playback to what's happening. You've got review work that's undertaken by industries themselves, where government might be a contributor. You might have work that's done at a federal level, a state level, and that might be in the public domain or it's internal to government. And even if it is internal to government, if it's, say, communities doing a piece of work that's important to a whole lot of agencies that are supporting them in the delivery of that, they'll be sharing of information to say, look, this is what our evaluation work is telling us what's happening. And what we're looking for in effect by, if it's good policy, you know, there's got to be a degree of of sharing information to allow for a good debate around policy change and investment. And, but at a Treasury level, we're obviously very interested in sort of the economic, the social, the environmental outcomes that have been achieved at a whole of government level.
Yeah.
But we will, depending on the issue, find ourselves in the weeds on some issues, or at a higher level and somewhere in between.
So when the budget papers come out, they're accompanied by a bunch of these service delivery statements, and so each...
Rather attractive document, isn't it?
It does look nice, yeah. So each of the agencies or departments produce one of these.
Yes.
And within these are some service standards that are like KPIs that sort of set some goals for the department and then provide some measurement against it. So the one I've got here is the Department of Communities, Housing and the Digital Economy. And if you go to the service standards for housing, some of the things that were measured, at least in last year's budget statement, was the percentage of new households assisted into government-owned and managed social housing rental who are high or high need, average wait times on the social housing register, percentage of under-occupied government-owned and managed social renting, social rental housing. So a whole bunch of measures that we can look at and see how that particular department is performing in relation to a particular area.
Yes.
So how are these service standards actually developed and set?
Yes, good area to focus on as an extension of the budget process, and as we were highlighting, evaluation work. You can't be every year evaluating every program to a level that would inform change. You've got to allow some programs to run and yield some results. But budget-related statements such as those have been a feature of budget papers in Australia for decades now. And what they're trying to do is highlight at a level below that aggregate budget level what's happening within respective portfolios, what are the priorities and what are they focused on. And there'll be descriptions of an aggregation of programs to say, well, this is a core activity of this agency. And okay, agency, tell us what are some key areas that would indicate what you're focused on and how you're tracking. And so they're trying to illustrate the key elements to what the department regards or the agency regards as important to that particular policy area. So, describe those housing measures there. And that is saying, well, we think this is a good indication of how we're tracking in this important policy area. And they are necessarily reliant on an agency coming forward with what they think are the right measures. Now, central agencies like Premier and Cabinet and Treasury will review those and say, well, yeah, we think that's a reasonable position to take. Or we might say, look, that one, maybe is in need of tightening up, just to be clear about what is the real measure and what is the ability to affect change in that you can control. And that's the balance to be struck there, because sometimes, if I talk about a totally different policy area, and it's a bit of a hackneyed example, but tourism, for argument's sake, could change. International tourism could change on the swings in the Australian dollar. Suddenly become a cheap destination. Was that something the department impacted? Well, no, it should be the effectiveness of the programs that they had to attract.
Sure.
And sometimes it's hard to measure, isn't it? But they are the product of an agency saying, well, in an accountability sense, here's some measures we think give an indication of how we're performing.
Yeah.
And they'll be reviewed annually, and central agencies will provide some input to that process.
And when you say they'll be reviewed annually, at what kind of time in the year are those particular things being reviewed?
Oh, at the same time that you start to pull together the budget papers for the upcoming budget.
Okay.
Yeah.
So pretty early on.
Yeah, I mean, you need to appreciate the machinery of government is that through the agency itself, they'll do their own review work, and then they'll put them up to central agencies who will provide some comment and feed them back, and they'll finalise those documents, because the data's got to be collected and reported upon. And so
Yes.
you've got to give people time to do that.
Yeah. So I guess, you know, I've heard from you a lot about the responsibility of the line agency. So sort of the central agency setting sort of the broad picture and priorities, and then agencies sort of feeding up what priorities should be in their particular area. And very much an ongoing dialogue, but that the agency driving sort of the policy for their particular area. We've had a few questions come through about housing, and so particularly people are concerned about how government's ensuring that there's sufficient investment to house our population, but in particular there's concerns about particular groups of people, so First Nations people and people exiting prisons, young people in connection with the justice system. And I guess what we've seen in the last few years is a bit of a collaboration between government agencies in relation to housing supply. And so interested to know how Treasury ended up in the housing space.
Look, I'm happy to give some insight to that. I wanted to just note, you described some very vulnerable cohorts there when it comes to that particular policy area, and I think government, regardless of whatever the policy area, is always very focused on those most vulnerable. And it is a big driver and consideration when it comes to budget priorities about looking after the most vulnerable in our communities. And yes, Treasury has been a lot more active in the housing space of late, but I think as the Premier highlighted at the Housing Summit, and the fact that we had a housing roundtable, I think that you attended, in a housing summit that you and many others attended, sort of scored the significance of housing policy in the current environment. It is, you know, a national, almost international challenge at the moment, but clearly a national challenge, and the Premier, I think, spoke to that at the summit. And unsurprisingly, Treasury was assisting government with its analysis of what it saw to be some of the drivers and some of the impacts that we're seeing in that market. And I really say at this point, if you indulge me, I was really very proud of the work that the Treasury team did in that area, and to Karen Hooper and her team and the economic and fiscal team under Dennis Malloy's leadership, I thought did a fantastic job, and I thought the Treasurer's contribution at the summit was excellent, because it provided us with some insights, and then the people who are really in that industry could sort of validate and say, well, actually this is what that really means. But that's been a huge economic challenge, and unsurprisingly Treasury's leaning in with its resources and its capabilities to try and help understand what's happening, and if we are going to make decisions, well, what are the right decisions to make? And that's a really tough one, because like most challenging social policy issues, on one hand we're trying to deal with the consequences, on the other hand we're trying to adopt a more preventative approach so we don't have those sorts of dislocations and impacts that we've seen. So Treasury obviously keen to keep talking about supply issues as much as dealing with the demand issues at this point in time. So yeah, I think that's really where Treasury probably stepped a bit further into housing policy. And the second one would be, as we spoke before, around the establishment of a specialised fund to provide an alternative program or strategy when it comes to improving and expanding housing supply. And I think, as noted at the summit, housing is more than just social housing. There's a continuum of housing options, and we need to look at the market in that context. And all the Housing Investment Fund is looking to do is improve supply, but adopting some different strategies to get there, to try and, I guess, step up the level of housing stock we have in the state and bring in new ideas, new thinking and additional monies to stimulate that.
So it was 2019 when the Housing Investment Fund was established, and we saw an initial $1 billion go into that fund and then another $1 billion last year.
Yes.
And the interest earned off that fund will go, so the interest off the $2 billion will go to supply, in accelerating supply, and the government's put a figure of 5,600 houses over the next 5 years, I think, to deliver those houses. You talk to bringing in innovative thinking and alternative funding sources.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about how the fund actually works in practice and the types of projects you foresee getting up through that process?
Yeah, certainly. So, as I mentioned, we have expressions of interest out in the market that are closing on 8 May, which will be our second round for the Housing Investment Fund. We are genuinely casting the net wide and seeing what really can be done, and we probably are approaching it on the continuum that there are existing programs that are out there actively building or buying from the market. We're trying to put together some alternatives that would complement those existing activities and provide a degree of agility or flexibility in how we might procure additional housing stock. So that might mean where, in our case, we've partnered with QIC, who then partners with the likes of ART and also the National Housing Investment Corporation, NIFIC, to bring together pools of capital that then provide a base for a program of stock being brought to market over a longer period of time. So that's sort of an example where before, because the state wasn't looking to partner up with capital, we weren't really seeing NIFIC, which is federal monies, being brought to bear on the Queensland landscape. So it's a mechanism that's allowed that to occur. So that's a bit of a point of differentiation.
And in that sort of partnership that you just spoke to, I think Brisbane Housing Company was part of that.
Yes.
So there is a
key
key role for the community services sector and community housing providers to play, both in terms of being a housing provider as well as our agencies that provide supports
and
to
the operators and the services that come in behind it.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and you know, it's the point probably a long-winded way I was trying to get to, is that it is centrally reliant upon entities like Brisbane Housing Company, who know the space well.
Yeah.
We're providing, in effect, the means and to attract additional capital to the development of projects led by entities like Brisbane Housing Company, who then know how to coordinate with service providers to look after people that are in need of additional services on top of housing itself.
So, you know, it's not a full description, but in some ways it's a mechanism to create partnerships where all the relevant pieces come together to provide bigger outcomes than would have otherwise been possible with the same amount of money through a traditional means of producing public housing through our existing model.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the goal.
Yeah.
Like we as I say, had the opportunity to establish a fund. We've identified that there's a long-term income stream off the back of that fund, you know, roughly $130 million each year that can be then leveraged, to use a tawdry financial term, to be leveraged to bring in additional forms of capital, and as I say, another string to the bow on what was fantastic work that's done on an annual basis by the housing part of our community's portfolio. So it's generally trying to add to our strategies when it comes to providing the housing stock, and just some alternative views and perspectives. And there's nothing like a fresh set of eyes on on a challenge, on an issue. So we don't come to it suggesting we know all the answers on this, and we really are reliant on others who've been in the space. And I think one thing to note with the Housing Investment Fund and also the additional $1 billion that was added to that fund to increase the size of the annual revenue stream is the government was also investing in the community housing provider sector here.
Yes.
Because we know it's about capability building. And I think because of the history here in Queensland, we didn't have a deeper market of larger scale community housing providers as maybe we saw in other jurisdictions. And so it was recognised that, hang on, we've got to build people's skills and capabilities. And so, you know, there's a genuine realisation that, you know, you just can't sort of push the money out and just hope it happens.
That's right, yeah.
You've got to work with the sector, and again, I think it's been a really pleasing part of the last few years for me, is that we've seen a lot more collaboration with amongst the industry itself and with government on some of these things. And I know it might not sort of sit firmly in the space for QCOSS, but you know, the build to rent projects that we've seen as well, and in adding another product into the market where in other jurisdictions they might call it like essential worker accommodation, where you're providing accommodation in areas that are close to employment centres, you know, be they hospitals and the like, where previously people might have had to get further and further afield to find affordable accommodation. The government's effort in this regard, I think, has been another area where I feel, you know, good to be in part of that process.
Yeah. And
I would also call out Queensland's build-to-rent model has included a very distinct segment of genuine affordable housing, not just build-to-rent at market rates. We're subsidising the provision of below market rate accommodations inside these commercial build-to-rent projects. So rather than build to sell, where someone builds a tower and sells all the apartments, they're going to run them as, you know, in effect, a rental block, and the government's subsidising the market rents for a percentage of those apartments.
Yeah.
And I can tell you from analysis of other jurisdictions, that's something that is not replicated to the same extent elsewhere. So again, I think, you know, it's all about trying to bring some, you know, fresh thinking and new ideas to the challenge.
Yeah, and I guess that sort of build to rent concept, you know, it can provide luxury accommodation for people who don't want to buy a property that's well maintained, but you know, the model is absolutely one that could be used to provide more social and affordable housing, along with at market rent, and because of the model providing an assurance that the condition of the housing will be maintained at a pretty pristine level. Yeah,
and so you know, the partnership between the sector, the private sector and government, I mean, that's the real
how it works.
Opportunity here.
Yeah.
And I unashamedly have a bit of a bias towards where we might have the opportunity to leverage the private sector with the community sector and government to affect some bigger outcomes. And I just think that's one example, and what we've been doing with the Housing Investment Fund is another. And I know on an annual basis, you know, non-government organisations are doing that. You know, they're bringing capability to bear that doesn't always exist within government, and they bring unique perspectives and you know, a different understanding and approach, and we've got to leverage that. And I know there's long-term partnerships between government and the NGO sector and delivery of some pretty critical services.
That's right.
And so it's no different from that, what we're looking to do in housing with the private sector.
Yeah. So maybe some of you have read Jim Chalmers' article that was in The Monthly this month about capitalism after the crisis. And he talks in this, Leon, about the potential for private sector and government partnerships in order to deal with social issues or to produce social outcomes. So, you know, in the housing space, we just talked about that.
Yeah.
Can you think of other examples where you're seeing sort of private sector partnerships with government and potentially with the community sector that are geared towards social outcomes?
Yes, I can. I mean, I think we've hit a very current example with the one I just outlined. But that goes to the heart of it, that there's some skills and capabilities that we should be drawing from all sources to address some, big challenges. And I know in my past life working with in banking that we're involved in, social ventures, social benefit, in social impact investing and the like, which I think is sort of referenced in Treasurer Chalmers's paper. And that's, again, trying to leverage capability, provide some incentive structures to affect some different outcomes and provide some insight to alternative ways to deliver services. It's been happening in health for a long period of time. It's been happening in education for a long period of time. And if it's reaching into areas that were deemed to be, just government in the past, disability services is a good case in point. Let's be open-minded about it. Let's understand what the downside risks are, and let's try and manage those risks rather than avoid them. So I think if we avoid them, we sort of deny ourselves the opportunity. So I don't sort of have a long list of specific examples for you. But
that was a pretty good list, though.
It is, isn't it? Like when you look at it, I mean, public-private partnership's been a big part of government for centuries. We just don't look at it that way. And we look at these financial models like PPPs and say, oh, that's the private sector into an area that traditionally has just been government. But I think there's any number of examples where government in the past has relied heavily on the private sector, and it's not just in economic infrastructure, it's in social infrastructure and social services.
And I guess, Treasurer Chalmers is going to this concept of a wellbeing economy where we're not just looking at developing budgets based on economic outcomes, but looking broadly at social outcomes as well. And so, it's within that context that he's talking about more partnerships with the private sector focused on those social outcomes.
Yeah. Look, I know talking amongst the leadership board of government, which is the name, if you've got all the DGs together, I don't know what you call them, like a gaggle of DGs or a mob of DGs or something, a parliament of DGs. But the distinction between social and economic, we decided it's a bit artificial.
Right, okay.
And while we still maintain that distinction, so not to contradict myself, but the crossover between people who would sit on one committee or the other became so large because people genuinely had a policy interest in both. And from a Treasury perspective, naturally, in that societal outcomes have a very strong impact on economic outcomes, without a doubt.
Yeah.
And so that's been writ large by the pandemic. And so we got the health solution right, and guess what? The economy went really well. So
great example.
that was proven up. So yeah, we sort of try and avoid making too much of the distinction, look at the issues and say, okay, what's the right solution and who should be involved in that?
Yeah.
And they're big churches now. Like lots of departments have purchased, where before if you said, well, that's that department, that's not good enough. And again, hats off to Rachel Hunter, to her management style is very much, we can all add and contribute here, and it's about supporting agencies in trying to achieve their outcomes, because it ultimately would be a benefit to us. So from a Treasury perspective, if we're much more effective in certain policy areas, then we won't be continuing to add money in with no demonstrable change in outcomes. And I think that's always going to be the challenge.
Yeah. So last question.
Are we out of time?
No, we're not totally out of time. But just
I didn't look too eager, did I, in saying that? No.
just really quickly, what would be your advice to our members who are online today and broadly about how the community services sector can influence the budget process, influence government's decisions in relation to what to prioritise and what to fund?
Look, I would say to reflect on, my association with this conversation. I think we got into it pretty early that it's not a binary point in time process.
Yeah.
You have to be invested in policy, and that's going to be stakeholder engagement. And honestly, I'm not trying to pump your tyres up here, but you do it really well. And I think QCOSS is a beneficiary of that, and all your members are the beneficiary of that. You've got to stay invested in the relationship, and you've got to be sharing information. And I always work on the assumption I need to put myself in your shoes, and I'd only ask the sector to also put themselves in government shoes. They've got a lot of competing priorities, and I just think that's always going to be the challenge. And everyone's saying, well, hang on, how could you prioritise X over Y? Governments are massive exercises, multidisciplinary, and there's always going to be those calls that are be made between an investment in X over Y. So I think some consideration of the challenge of government is not a cry for sympathy. It's just a realisation that the business of government is not easy, but I think that's what makes it so exciting and challenging. And so that would be the other point there, is just let's acknowledge that this is an ongoing conversation, not one you do a couple of months before the budget. And the good sharing of information and stakeholder engagement is really, really important. And let's think about priorities, like what's really top of mind. And I know QCOSS, again, very good at highlighting, look, we've been talking to, engaging with the membership. We're seeing where our clients, for the want of a better term again, are feeling most pressure and pain, and these what we see as the sort of the key priorities in the year ahead. And you keep reviewing those and evolving those. So giving some idea to government, well, look, we had to really separate the nice to have from the must have. These are the must haves. Yeah.
And I'm going to pump the tyres of our members right now and say, over the years, the community services sector, I think, working collaboratively, have achieved some really good outcomes. And I'd point to the investment into community and neighbourhood centres last year, and the housing investment the year before was clearly connected to the community services sector asking for more investment in those areas. The year before that, we had some really good outcomes in terms of financial resilience workers, and Leon's spoken to the indexation outcome. We at QCOSS, we take really seriously how we put our budget submission together. We every year meet with our members across the state and talk about what the emerging issues are and what priorities they'd like to see funded. We run a survey every year, the Australian Community Services Sector Survey. We take the Queensland data from that, and we also put our draft budget submission back out to members while we're consulting with government. So that process is just closed for 2023, and I've had the opportunity to meet with Leon and his team, as well as many other Director Generals and Ministers, to talk about your priorities. And we're going to be publishing those from today on our website. We're going to also send everyone online a copy. The priorities for the sector this year were related to housing, funding an alternative response to children under the age of 14 interacting with the justice system, funding related to the costs of energy, funding related to indexation and making sure we can be a human rights respecting sector, funding related to women's equality, and also funding related to focusing on those early years, so not just children 0 to 5, but families who have children aged 0 to 5. Sorry, there was one other one, and that was around investment into overcoming the digital divide. So we'll send those out, but I think it's really worth underscoring how good it is to engage in our process as well, because when we get that information from you, that's what we communicate to government as the priorities. And so we do take that role of coordinating those priorities really, really seriously. From here, we're really looking forward to, we'll publish our budget papers, continue our advocacy around those, and then following the budget, in the days following the budget, we'll have our usual budget analysis and breakfast with the Treasurer. And so encouraging you, if you want to come along to our annual budget breakfast, you can register now. So thank you so much for attending this afternoon's session, and we hope you have a really wonderful and restful weekend. Thank you so much, Leon.
Thanks, Amy.